Welcome to the Open Forum in the Villages, Florida podcast. In this show, we talk to leaders in the community, leaders of clubs, and interesting folks who live here in the Villages, to give perspectives of what is happening here in the Villages, Florida. We are a listener-supported podcast.
How can you support our podcast? This is Mike Roth, and listeners, I'm thrilled to share with you this podcast, which is my passion project for you. This podcast brings me joy, brings you knowledge, inspiration, and a lot of things that people need to know about the Villages and the people that are living here and what's actually going on. Creating this podcast is a labor of love, even though it demands more time than I can easily spare. But hey, time isn't something we can buy back, right? Now, here's where you come in, the unsung heroes and heroines. You can help us keep the podcast alive and thriving. How? By becoming a supporter. There are two simple ways that you can support us. The first is a small monthly donation. Visit our podcast website, openforumin.com, and click on the black supporter box. Even a small $3 to $10 a month donation makes a difference. And guess what? You can cancel anytime, no strings attached. The second way that you can contribute to the podcast is by making a purchase of an Amazon product at Amazon standard prices. That way there's no extra money out of your pocket, but you are supporting the podcast. Check every week because we're going to be adding new Amazon products that you can buy and support the podcast with. And your support means the world to us. Stay curious, stay inspired, and keep those headphones on. This is Mike Roth on Open Forum in the Villages, Florida. I'm here today with Lou Reiter. Thanks for joining me, Lou.
Thanks, Mike.
Lou, why don't you give our audience a little bit of your background in law enforcement?
I've been involved in it for 63 years now. The first 20, I was with the Los Angeles Police Department, and I had 22 different assignments, but I retired as one of the deputy chiefs of police. The last 43 years, I've been a private consultant, and I principally do training for law enforcement audiences in internal affairs, how to conduct administrative investigations on shootings and in-custody deaths and misconduct allegations. I also work with insurance companies to audit their agencies that they represent, and maybe they're experiencing a higher kind of loss factor and they want to find out why that is. And then in addition, I act as an expert witness in civil trials where citizens or law enforcement officers are suing the police agency.
And which police chiefs did you work for in Los Angeles?
I worked for 3. One was there only a year. Bill Parker was the one that kind of came up the same period of time that I was created. And Bill Parker was the creation of professional policing in Los Angeles. Then I worked for a guy for 8 years named Ed Davis. The last chief I worked for was Daryl Gates.
You retired in what year?
1981. So there is life after retirement.
So you did 20 years in the Los Angeles Police Department. And how many years were you in internal investigations there?
Actually, being an investigator and being someone who put on the administrative tribunals, it was only 2 years. But once I made lieutenant, captain, commander, and then deputy chief, 80% of my time really was spent with personnel issues, which dealt with internal affairs.
Why do you feel that police departments should investigate themselves?
Police work is different than what's on television or in the movies. It would be like trying to have a citizen investigate why a pilot made an error in a plane. There are things that only active practitioners realize and know what should be done, and you don't look at what's on television or in the movies. And so police have that background, and more importantly, they know how their officers were trained and what they should do, and they know the written policies and rules that the officers have to follow. They have the capability of doing that. Now, do they all do it? Not that necessarily true.
And what is the most common complaint that you hear about?
I remember I was giving a presentation up at Suffolk Law School in Boston, and one of the persons I asked that question to, and she says, I imagine that 80% of what you investigate are use of force or improper use of force. That's not true. Every time we have done an audit, somewhere about 80% of citizen complaints are attitude, verbal abuse, and neglect of duty. They just didn't get the service they expected they would get, or they didn't get the treatment they thought that officer should provide to them. And really, the serious misconduct narrows down into less than 10% of most police departments. And when you get into criminal misconduct, it's 1 or 2% at the most.
Only 1 or 2%. So all of these TV shows we see about corruption in police departments, they're really probably just made up.
That's good for TV. But police work is just like any other work. 10% of the employees are stars. You've got 80% who do the job that they've been paid to do. You get 10% that are slackers. You only got about 1% who have taken that badge and the authority they have and use it to steal, to rape, to abuse people. So it's a small percentage. And you have to remember, when it comes to policing, we have 18,000 police agencies. Other country in the world has that kind of structure. And in fact, 50% of our police departments have 10 or fewer officers, and 88% of them have 25 or fewer. So most of them are very small, almost like families when you look at it that way. It's not unusual to run into a department that has one police officer. He's the chief and the principal police officer, cop on the beat.
We run into big cities, that's certainly not true.
Yeah, but the big cities, you're only talking about 200 of them. We got 18,000 police agencies. Look locally here. Wildwood has about 60 officers. I think Lady Lake has 35 or 36 officers. Sumter County might have 200, maybe 250, including correctional officers. We are more small here in the villages than if you get over into Orlando and some of the metro areas like Metro Miami and Dade County and Palm Beach County.
What are the most serious acts of police misconduct, and how frequently do they really occur?
Like I said before, less than 1% of the time, the cases that Internal Affairs investigates are serious. And of course, the serious ones, the one that I find the most despicable really is sexual abuse and on-duty sexual abuse, where they're abusing crime victims, or they're stopping young women, usually young women, on traffic violations. And to get out of a ticket, they encourage the person to engage in sexual act. They're using their authority. In addition, we have some officers that either like to use force unnecessarily, or they get wrapped up in the incident and they get goaded into using unnecessary use of force. And then, of course, we get theft. We have the incident in Baltimore with the gun trace task force. All of them went to federal prison, but they started off trying to bring guns and narcotics off the street. To do that, they cut corners on probable cause affidavits. They dropped contraband narcotics on these suspects. They stole money so they might get $600,000 worth of cash, and they would book maybe $500,000 and split the other $100,000 between them. Those are cases, but they're rare.
And now we'll hear a short Alzheimer's tip from Dr. Craig Curtis. Dr. Curtis, what can someone do if they know that they have Alzheimer's that runs in their family?
There's a lot that they can do. Published actually in the Journal of the American Medical Association in February of 2024, so this month. This was a study done primarily at Rush University in Chicago, looking at those with brain amyloid, so those people that already have amyloid. Can a healthy lifestyle protect them from developing dementia? And the answer was yes, by following these five healthy habits that were tracked. They did not smoke. They did moderate exercise for at least 150 minutes a week. They kept their alcohol consumption diet. They used approximately 530 autopsies to prove that those that followed those healthy lifestyle habits actually had less amyloid in their brain.
With over 20 years of experience studying brain health, Dr. Curtis's goal is to educate the village's community on how to live a longer, healthier life. To learn more, visit his website, craigcurtismd.com, or call 352-500-5400. 5252 to attend a free seminar.
Thank you, Dr. Curtis. And when Internal Affairs is investigating a case, what are the rules of evidence and interviewing officers?
And a lot of people get stumped here because they expect Internal Affairs, when they're dealing, let's say, with a serious violation on the part of a police officer, to follow the same rules they see on Law and Order and in all these trials. And there's a difference because when we're conducting an administrative investigation, which means that maybe a policy or a rule has been violated, we've been given a lot of latitude. In fact, back 1963, the Supreme Court said in a case called Garrity versus New Jersey, which was essentially a ticket-fixing scheme in New Jersey. The prosecutor in that case told Garrity, who was a police chief, okay, if you don't answer these questions in this criminal probe we're dealing with, you're going to get fired as the police chief. That went up to the Supreme Court in 1963. And the Supreme Court said, whoa, wait a minute now. The chief still criminally has the same rights as any citizen. So if you're investigating the chief criminally, that person doesn't have to give testimony against his self-interest. That's called a Fifth Amendment violation. No citizen is required to testify against themselves. But administratively, they said, public employees, that's the distinction. Public employees have to cooperate with the administrative investigation if it's dealing with a policy or a rule violation. They cannot lie, they must be truthful, and they must cooperate with the investigation. They must be open. And a lot of citizens don't understand that because they say, well, wait a minute, an officer's been involved in a shooting and there's somebody been killed by that shooting, and you're going to wait 5 days or in some cases 10 days to the officer. If it were a citizen, they'd be interviewed right then. Actually, they wouldn't, because they would lawyer up and lawyers say, don't say anything.
In the police situation on television, it always seems that they say, don't say anything until you have your union rep there.
That's true. And I agree with that. I'm an advocate, even though I was never part of the union in Los Angeles. I agree with that because today there's more chance of an officer being criminally charged with something he or she did on the job. Let's say a shooting or in a jail cell, use of force and somebody gets killed during that where they're trying to control the person. They call them progressive prosecutors, have been elected ever since George Floyd in 2020. We've got a lot of progressive prosecutors, and they are bringing criminal charges against officers for things that 20 years ago they never would have. As an example, in Washington, D.C., a couple of officers are drag racing with their patrol cars, and they total them both out. In the past, they would have said, police department, you handle that yourself. These guys were criminally charged. The union now, if they have a union, and remember, we're down in Florida, and while the PBA and FOP active, still a lot of departments here that have no union representation. I think all officers should be allowed to have some form of representation when they're being compelled to answer these questions. And why is that? The representative can make objections, so later if the state decides to try to use what they've said while they're being ordered to answer, that attorney can say, Judge, we objected to that, and that should be excluded from the trial here because they were compelled to answer those questions. So it's become more of an issue today than it ever has been. Now, in evidence, we talked about evidence too.
Sure.
We can require an officer to pee in the bottle or take a blood test or disrobe. We have to be conscious of his dignity, but if we're dealing only with a rule violation, we don't need a warrant for that. Today, the most common tool where we find police misconduct is in their use of cell phones. Many officers carry 3 cell phones. They carry a department-issued, They carry one where they call their family, and they got another one that they use to call their girlfriends or to do their dirty business on.
Oh.
So you want to have access to that if you're conducting this administrative investigation. Now, if you're looking for a criminal charge, you got to get a warrant to get into that phone. But you don't need a warrant if you're only conducting an administrative investigation.
So the department-issued cell phone, that's the property of the police department, could always be examined for evidence.
Yes, there's less of what they call an expectation of privacy because the department, and now the department should have a policy that says your department-issued cell phone or your locker or your car that we give you, there is no expectation of privacy. At any time, without any reason, we can come and examine it. Some departments don't have that written policy, but you're still allowed to do that. Again, if you're looking for a policy or a rule violation, if you're looking for something criminal, even with a department phone, you need a warrant.
And what about that second phone, the personal phone that the officer might be carrying?
That's always the issue. The officer will say, it's in my wife's name. The courts have said, we don't care. If you carry it on duty and they're investigating something and it could possibly give evidence toward this rule or policy violation, you've got to cooperate. Now, if you don't cooperate, you're then guilty of insubordination. And you can just be fired because you've been insubordinate.
Okay.
We don't even care if we can prove the original charge.
From what you said, it would seem that if an officer is carrying a third cell phone, they're automatically a dirty officer.
Oh, no, that's not true. For a lot of reasons.
The first phone, department issue, understand why you have that. Second phone, for family business, fully understand that. Third phone gets a little bit out of line in my mind.
Yeah, it's a red flag. Just like if somebody gives a crime victim a business card and puts their personal cell phone on it, that right away is a red flag. Why would you not use the department issued? Now, if they wanted to, they could have a rule that said you can only carry the department issued cell phone, and you could use that to call home for personal needs.
I probably would object to that and say I'd have my own second cell phone.
And that's exactly. So, I mean, we could create that. It's like the brouhaha we went through years ago where every time you got out of the car, you had to put your hat on. And we went overboard looking at hats rather than looking at what they did, good and bad. So it's the same thing. They're going to carry at least one other cell phone. Get over it. We have the authority to get in it, to make them turn over to us. We have the authority to have them. We won't give me the password, but you put your password in there and open it up. Let me see. I can do a screenshot. If necessary, I can take the phone, and to protect everybody's interest, you have a third party do a whole dump on the phone. And then that person segments out the things that are specific to the allegation of misconduct you're investigating. We have to treat these people with respect. Cell phone today has more personal information than most of our houses have.
Yeah, I'm carrying more stuff in my cell phone than I think is absolutely minimally necessary because it's convenient because of the programs that I'm running on the cell phone other times, or the traps that the passwords or two-factor authentication have caused in using the device.
The other thing, they can tell where you've been.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they can track your movements to determine, are you in fact patrolling? Are you sitting behind a warehouse sleeping? Are you going visiting a lady friend? Cell phones have a great deal of data today.
Now, is that similar to what we see in the Hollywood portrayal where police officer is carrying 3 guns?
There are some. Many of them will carry a second gun, and that is really for their protection. Say if their first gun is taken away from them, or if they lose it in a fight, they have a backup weapon. Yes, every now and then we do. In fact, there was a friend of mine was an expert witness on a case in Washington where these guys were carrying these long stiletto daggers. No ungodly reason to carry anything like that. And what were they using? They were using it as a throwdown weapon if they shot someone and they shouldn't have. In this case, they all piled on this guy, and it was one of what we call this in custody death. And as a consequence, the city settled that case for $5.8 million because they had this throwdown stiletto dagger that they claimed the subject got and was trying to stab them with it. There was no reason for any of these officers to carry that kind of tool.
Now, let's spend a couple of minutes talking about the movement that came up a couple of years ago, defunding the police. Can that really work? Or is that just a stupid idea?
The word was wrong. What they should have used is let's reimagine the role of the police. We're a very conservative group. Most police officers would be conservative, if not ultra-conservative. We're very resilient, too. I've been around a long time, so every time we go back to the riots of the late 60s, I was out in the streets in the Watts riots, and we had all sorts of commissions. And then we had the Rodney King incident. We had all sorts of commissions. And then we had the incident in Ferguson. And then we had the George Floyd in 2020, more commissions. Yet they have all said the same thing. They have all identified areas that policing needs to improve in. One of the big areas all of these have said is citizens should have an easy way to seek redress for grievances they may have on the police. And yet still in a lot of police departments, they've made it cumbersome to do that. So I think the term defunding was wrong because we need police officers and we should have said, let's reimagine them. And what is it that you want your local police officer to do? Take the villages here. What do we really want the police officer to do? I think nobody wants to get a ticket, but we know that traffic is a big issue here. So we want police officers to educate and enforce traffic violations. The other thing, we need police officers.
Well, that's an interesting word that you use. It's splintered under my fingernail.
Most of these officers are out there with very little direct supervision. The only way we can supervise what an officer does is by citizens voicing a complaint if they have one. Now, the other big thing we've got...
When a citizen would offer a complaint, all of the citizens' word against the police officers' word.
Not so much nowadays, because most of them have what we call a body-worn camera, and that should be on during any traffic stop. Now, if it isn't, that's something the supervisors need to be alerted to. We found that these officers were regularly dropping evidence on people, and they only found that out because they reviewed the body-worn cameras. We've got programs now where you can feed keywords in, and the computer identifies those segments of the body-worn cameras that are in the cloud, wherever that is. That's a form of oversight. In addition, a lot of citizens, when they're stopped, turn on their cell phone. So they're recording it as well. It's the idea.
Not every citizen is smart enough to turn off, or B, not every citizen is smart enough to have the recordings permanently captured in a place where they can be played back at the appropriate moment.
If you're out there on I-75, we expect to have a certain number of tickets written. These are the violations that are causing accidents. We want you to look for people who are committing these kinds of violations. Now, the officer has a discretion. They can look the other way. They can issue a warning. They can write a ticket and drop it down 10 miles an hour so you don't go into that excessive speed ticket, which costs you a ton of money. Or they can write a big ticket item. And unfortunately, some cops will look at it and say, what's the attitude of the person I stopped? And if they're amenable to the enforcement, they walk away fine. If the person gives them a hard time, the pencil is pretty mighty when it comes to writing tickets. So the officer hasn't done anything wrong. He's just enforcing the letter of the law, and it's going to cost you a bunch more money.
Yeah, here in the villages, I think that the enforcement around the traffic circles really needs to be increased. Just driving up Morse Boulevard from 44 to Spanish Springs on an average day in the wintertime, I will see at least one violation of traffic circle law, and B, many times, 1 out of 3 times, I'll see someone violating a traffic circle that almost caused an accident.
One of the problems I've got, being an outsider now, it boggles my mind. You have 2 lanes of traffic on the traffic circles.
Some of them.
Most of them have 2 lanes, and you've got the outer lane, and then you've got the inner lane. What really boggles my mind is because they allow the inner lane to cross right across right lane. They want to exit the circle. Anywhere else in the world, you can't do that. You have to be in the furthest most outside lane to make that curve.
But some traffic circles have a no-go zone, one of the 4 corners, so that you're forced from the center lane to the outside lane, whether or not you're continuing around the circle or you're going to exit. And that makes sense. There are a lot of traffic circles and intersections where people are allowed to cross the right lane from the left lane to make an exit.
Oh, it's painted on the roadway. There are hash marks that are painted on the roadway. That boggled my mind and I've been here just about a year now. But I'm very cautious. And if someone's in the traffic circle, I don't try to enter it because I don't know what they're going to do. But it is. Then, of course, you get the people that think they're in a Le Mans trying to go through the traffic circle, and they don't even slow down.
A little bit going through.
Yeah, on 2 wheels coming around the corner. But there is a need for traffic enforcement here.
And I'd almost say that most of the traffic circles need a traffic camera. Not actually 1, probably at least 4, so that the traffic enforcement could issue warnings automatically to people who are new to the villages or accidentally making a mistake, physical damage or people getting hurt.
Yeah. The other thing local law enforcement have to contend with here is drinking, driving. We have enough terrible collisions, and drinking starts real early here in the villages. The other thing that surprised me since I moved here is the number of domestic calls, and principally Sumter County Sheriff seems to handle most of those. And that's a real nerve-wracking call for any police officer because you're invading the personal space of the people in that home. And yet we have a lot of it. And some of it is understandable. Some of it is not understandable. We've got young people living with their parents and they're abusing their senior parents. But Sumter County seems to be doing a good job.
Yeah, there's some of that. And there are other things. But I want to thank you, Lou, for being on the show with us today.
Mike, it's been enjoyable for me. And if you have a question that comes in the law enforcement, or if one of your viewers or listeners has a question too, they can reach out to you and I'd be happy to answer any questions. And I'm part of the village now and I'm full-time, even though I'm still working.
I know you've written a couple of books, Lou.
I have.
Yes, I'm holding one of them now. It says Broken Badges, Cases from Police Internal Affairs. Is this a novel or is this really a true story?
They're fiction, but they've been cases that I've all been involved in. I've changed the names and I've changed the locations. And now you don't want to read my books if you're offended by language or sex, because unfortunately, I'm dealing in that 1% we talked about, the 1% that abuse their badge and take advantage of other people.
How many books do you actually have?
I have 2 fiction books, so I have 60 copies of each one. But I have another 500-page manual about how you do internal affairs.
Okay.
So that's in the 4th edition now.
So if someone wanted to read this fictionalized account called Broken Badges, how would they do that?
They could email me. Easy email, Lou Reiter @gmail.com.
Spell
now that's REIT as in Tom, ER. Lou is LOU, all one word.
Thanks for joining us, Lou.
My pleasure, Mike.
Remember, our next episode will be released next Friday at 9 a.m. Should you want to become a major supporter of the show or have questions, please contact us at mike@rothvoice.com. This is a shout out for supporters Tweet Coleman, Ed Williams, Paul Sorgen, and major supporter Dr. Craig Curtis at K2 in the Villages. If you know someone who should be on the show, Contact us at mike@rothvoice.com. We thank everyone for listening to the show. The content of the show is copyrighted by Roth Voice 2024. All rights reserved.